Okay, let's unpack this. We are initiating a comprehensive exploration today into one of the most serious and just long-running criminal investigations in modern Australian history. We're talking about the Claremont serial killings.
Right, these are events that really, they just shattered the sense of security in Perth, Western Australia, and they unfolded across 1996 and 1997.
It's a case of immense gravity.
It is. The material we have compiled gives us a really detailed narrative of the disappearances, the state's monumental response to them, and then, the years of cold case frustration.
And finally, that breakthrough that came decades later.
The one that finally led to a conviction, yes.
The sheer scale of the police operation, it really sets the scene here. The sources describe this as Western Australia's longest-running, biggest, and most expensive investigation ever.
And that complexity is precisely what we aim to understand today. The timeline of the crimes, the forensic hurdles that really stalled progress for so long.
And then the pivotal, meticulous evidence that ultimately provided that resolution.
Before we move into the facts, though, I think it's essential we just pause for a moment.
Of course.
And reflect on the human element here. This story is, at its heart, about profound loss.
Yes.
We're discussing the lives of three young women, Sarah Spires, Jane Rimmer, and Ciara Glennon. And the generational trauma suffered by their families and the entire community.
We approach this with the most sincere sympathy for that tragic cost. So let's begin where the terror started, Claremont.
For a brief but terrifying period, this affluent Perth suburb, known for its busy late-night entertainment strip, it just became the center of a crisis.
And we were talking about specific hotspots, right? Places like the Continental Hotel, Club Bayview.
The Ocean Beach Hotel, yeah. All very close to each other.
Claremont really was the unfortunate geographic epicenter.
It was. These venues drew huge crowds of young people, which means the killer was likely preying on that familiarity.
The expectation that a young woman leaving a crowded club would just be, finding a taxi or meeting a ride home.
Exactly. And the terrifying commonality of it all, happening in the early hours of the morning, it established a very clear and very frightening pattern incredibly quickly.
The first victim was Sarah Spires. She was just 18 years old.
And she vanished in the early hours of Saturday, January 27th, 1996.
Spears had been out with friends. She left Club Bayview around 2 a.m.
And we can trace her movements with remarkable and chilling precision for the next few minutes.
So what do we know?
At 2:06 a.m., she was using a public phone booth. It was on the corner of Sterling Road and Sterling Highway. She made a call to Swan Taxis.
Now, the destination she requested, that's an interesting detail the sources highlight.
It is.
She was living with her sister in South Perth, but she requested a ride to Mosman Park, which is a different nearby suburb. Why?
The documents don't offer a definitive reason. It's one of those lingering questions. But it adds to the complexity and the urgency of her final moments.
Maybe she was meeting someone else?
Perhaps. Or maybe trying to avoid waking someone at home. What we do know for sure is that she was last sighted waiting alone near that phone booth.
And she was seen.
By 3 separate eyewitnesses. And these witnesses noticed something else that was critical.
What was that?
They saw an unidentified car stop nearby. The interaction, if there was one, was very brief.
And then the taxi she called arrived.
Yes. The responding taxi got there at 2:09 a.m.
So only 3 minutes after her call was logged.
Just 3 minutes. And she was gone.
That narrow a window suggests an abduction that was either highly practiced or just extremely opportunistic and fast.
Incredibly fast. And crucially, Sarah Spires is the only one of the 3 victims whose remains have never been located.
Which leaves her family without that complete closure, even to this day.
A truly awful situation for them.
So the community had barely begun to process this first disappearance when the nightmare just escalated.
Less than 5 months later, Jane Rimmer, age 23, vanished on the night of June 9th, 1996.
Jane Rimmer had also been out, moving between a few of the Claremont venues with her friends.
That's right. Her friends decided to take a cab home, but Rimmer chose to stay in the area for a bit longer.
A decision that proved fatal.
It did. The final definitive record we have of her movements is this grainy but critical security footage.
And what does it show?
It was captured at 12:04 a.m. It shows her waiting alone outside the Continental Hotel, just standing there, maybe expecting a ride or hoping to find one.
But unlike with Sarah Spires, there was a tragic recovery in Jane Rimmer's case.
Yes, 55 days later.
And how was she found?
Her body was discovered on August 3, 1996. It was a family out foraging for wildflowers who found her.
Oh, how
She
awful.
was located in dense bushland near a place called Wellard, which is roughly 40 kilometers south of Claremont.
40 kilometers, so that's about 25 miles.
Yes, a significant distance. Her body was naked, and the remote disposal site immediately signaled that the perpetrator had deliberately taken steps to conceal the crime.
And that they knew the area far outside the city.
Exactly, this wasn't random.
Then, 9 months after Rimmer, the fear returned. March 1997.
The disappearance of Ciara Glennon. She was 27, a well-regarded lawyer living in Mosman Park.
C.R. Glennon's experience, it mirrored the others, didn't it?
It did. She had been at the Continental Hotel with colleagues. She left the venue to make her own way home. And the timeline, again, is very specific.
Around 12:30 a.m., she was seen walking south along Sterling Highway.
And similar to Sarah Spires, she was seen interacting with a vehicle.
The same pattern.
That's right. 3 men who were waiting at a nearby bus stop witnessed Ciara interact with an unidentified light-colored vehicle that pulled up alongside her.
This recurring detail of the victim seemingly interacting with a waiting car, it suggests the killer was operating with some form of, deception? Perceived authority?
It's a very real possibility, something that made them feel safe enough to approach the car.
And her recovery also came relatively quickly.
19 days later, on April 3rd, 1997, her semi-clothed body was discovered by a bushwalker
Where was she found?
near a track in some scrubland off Piccadilly Road. Now, if you contrast this location with Jane Rimmer's,
Rimmer was south of Claremont.
right, Ciara Glennon was found 40 kilometers north of Claremont near Eglinton.
So let's just step back and look at this pattern. We have 3 young women all last seen late at night in the Claremont Center, often seen interacting with an unidentified vehicle, and the 2 who were found. Their bodies were dumped significant distances away, but in completely opposite directions.
One 40 kilometers south, one 40 kilometers north.
What does that geographical scattering tell you?
It's a critical analytical point. It shows a perpetrator who was highly mobile and very comfortable operating across a vast area of the Perth metropolitan region and its fringes.
Not just sticking to one area they knew well.
Exactly. The striking similarities in the victim's demographics, the abduction site, the time, the disposal method, it all led police to an undeniable and terrifying conclusion.
That they were hunting a single, highly dangerous serial killer.
Yes. And that finding escalated the response instantly. It prompted the Western Australian government to offer a record $250,000 reward for information. The pressure on law enforcement became immense.
That pressure translated immediately into a massive organizational response then.
It did. The case was formally taken over by the Major Crime Squad within 48 hours of Sarah Spires' vanishing. They recognized the severity.
But it was after Rimmer disappeared that the need for a sustained, dedicated unit became clear.
That's when they formed Task Force Macro.
So what was Task Force Macro?
It was established as a centralized, high-resource unit to manage the just overwhelming number of leads and coordinate this incredibly complex investigation. It swelled in size very quickly.
How big are we talking?
At its peak, Macro was a huge operation. Over 100 dedicated members split across 10 specialized teams. It represented an unprecedented mobilization of police resources in the state's history.
And initially, Macro's focus seems to have been heavily on trying to piece together those final moments.
Yes, especially around those unidentified vehicles seen near Spires and Glennon. The focus was tactical, immediate. Who was driving those cars? Could the killer be someone whose job involved late-night driving?
And that line of inquiry led directly to one of the most significant and controversial parts of the early investigation.
The intense suspicion directed towards Perth's taxi drivers.
Why them specifically?
The logic was, well, Spires had called a taxi. River was waiting outside a hotel at closing time, a prime spot for a cab. The theory was that if the perpetrator was using a vehicle to lure or transport the victims, a professional driver had the perfect cover and access.
To suspect an entire industry, though, that's a monumental undertaking.
It was. It led to an extraordinary mass-scale forensic operation. Macro initiated a massive fingerprinting and DNA testing exercise targeting the thousands of licensed taxi drivers in Western Australia.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare, not to mention the impact on the reputations of those drivers.
It was incredibly intrusive and unprecedented. But while the immediate goal finding the killer within that pool failed, the exercise had these significant, if unintended, consequences.
Such as?
The investigation uncovered serious issues. It resulted in 78 drivers with significant criminal histories being delicensed. And it led to much stricter standards for driver eligibility and tougher rules about decommissioned taxis.
So it cleaned up the industry. In a way.
In a way, yes. The sheer scope of it just demonstrates the depth of Macro's resource commitment in those early years.
And to protect this huge undertaking, they implemented extremely strict confidentiality protocols.
Information control was paramount. They enforced these protocols to prevent any leaks to the media about the specific details of the victims' deaths or injuries.
And this wasn't just about secrecy.
No, it was a psychological tool.
Yeah.
By keeping those facts quiet, investigators ensured that if anyone, a witness or more importantly a suspect, came forward claiming to know something, the police could use those details to verify their story or to instantly dismiss a false confession.
But moving beyond logistics, the sources indicate that this pressure cooker environment led to some highly unorthodox and controversial tactics.
This is where you see the investigative team reaching, you could argue, out of desperation. One of the more controversial approaches was distributing these questionnaires to 110 persons of interest.
And these weren't standard interviews.
Not at all. They were designed to be highly confrontational, psychologically coercive.
And the critique points to questions like, are you the killer?
Precisely. That level of direct confrontation in a questionnaire is highly irregular. The goal was to get a strong reaction, maybe a self-incriminating stress response, not just to gather information.
Critics later said this showed a bias, an unhealthy focus on psychological pressure over hard evidence.
They did. And Macro also looked internationally for solutions, bringing in experts and importing equipment.
Right, they brought in criminal profilers and even a lie detector machine.
Yes. Despite polygraph evidence being pretty much inadmissible in Australian courts, it just speaks to the depth of frustration they were feeling. But perhaps the most shocking detail reflecting this desperation
Was the interaction with a known, convicted serial killer.
accepting an offer from David Burney to assist the investigation.
What do the sources say about how that even came about?
Burney, who, along with his partner, was responsible for the horrific Morehouse murders, was serving a life sentence. He claimed he had this unique insider knowledge of how serial offenders operate and offered to help.
And an officer from Macro took him up on it?
They did. This was widely condemned as highly unethical, unorthodox. It crossed a significant moral line in the pursuit of a lead. And it just underscores the immense, unrelenting pressure the task force was under.
And Task Force Macro eventually faced considerable censure for what critics called an overly narrow focus.
Yes, and this wasn't a fleeting theory. This narrow focus lasted for years, and it centered entirely on one individual.
Lance Williams.
Lance Williams, a Cotslow public servant. Macro came under immense scrutiny for committing resources to this one suspect for an entire decade. It suggests a strong case of confirmation bias had taken root.
How did Williams even come to their attention back in 1998?
Williams attracted attention during a decoy operation. Police officers, female officers acting as potential victims, were observed by Williams. He was allegedly driving around the Claremont area after midnight.
And his behavior was deemed suspicious.
Suspicious enough, yes. He was reportedly seen circling the area up to 30 times. That was enough for him to be immediately flagged as the prime suspect.
And for the next 10 years, he lived under intense surveillance.
Unimaginable surveillance. He was interviewed extensively, 6 times at length, subjected to immense public and private scrutiny. The police were convinced he was their man.
But they could never find the evidence to charge him.
Never. No direct evidence, no forensic link, no compelling witness testimony. And he consistently maintained his innocence. The police finally, and very reluctantly, declared him no longer a person of interest in late 2008.
That narrow focus wasted a decade of resources and investigative time. A key criticism that would haunt Macro's legacy.
It is. Williams died in 2018, having lived the last 20 years of his life under that shadow of suspicion. It's a classic example of investigative tunnel vision.
And while this was happening, forensic technology was evolving.
Exactly. The task force became so focused on the behavioral profile of Williams that they potentially missed new avenues that were emerging. While Macro officially wound down in 2005, the evidence was meticulously preserved, and that decision proved absolutely critical.
And that persistence paid off dramatically in December 2015. After years of dormancy, a huge forensic breakthrough.
This is the moment the investigation pivoted entirely away from behavioral profiling and back to hard science.
No, what was it?
Investigators finally identified tiny microscopic fibers found on Jane Rimmer's body, and they were traced back to a specific source.
A Holden Commodore VS Series 1 vehicle.
Exactly. This wasn't just a general fiber type. It was identified as carpet material unique to that make and model of car, manufactured within a specific window of time.
So this one piece of evidence completely redefined the suspect pool.
It did. It took the investigation from targeting known suspicious locals to hunting for a specific vehicle associated with the crime.
And that fiber analysis breakthrough, combined with advances in DNA matching technology, provided the momentum they needed.
Which leads us directly to the eventual suspect, Bradley Robert Edwards.
Edwards, born in 1968, came onto the police radar through this convergence of forensic data. He was arrested on December 22, 2016, at his house in Kewdale.
And he was immediately arrested in connection with the deaths of Jane Rimmer and Sierra Glennon.
What's remarkable, according to the sources, is that Edwards seemingly had no link to the primary Claremont investigation during the task force macro years.
None. He wasn't one of the 110 persons of interest they focused on for so long.
His exposure came entirely from cold case reviews linking forensic data from his past.
That's the crucial point. He was hiding in plain sight, not fitting the earlier behavioral profiles they had fixated upon. Edwards had a pattern of offending that began years earlier.
And it was the DNA evidence from those previous crimes that provided the necessary bridge to the Claremont murders.
Yes, the prosecution introduced 5 non-murder charges that Edwards ultimately pleaded guilty to, and these charges were absolutely vital to the case.
So let's look at those prior attacks, because they span a long period leading up to 1996, and they established a chilling pattern, starting with the 1988 Huntingdale attack.
This incident happened on February 15, 1988. It was a terrifying home invasion, a break-and-enter, and the unlawful detention of an 18-year-old woman.
And his involvement here provided the very first piece of his DNA profile.
That's right. As the attacker fled the scene, he dropped a stolen item, a kimono, which was recovered by police.
And the DNA on that discarded kimono was the forensic goldmine, although its significance wasn't immediately realized.
Exactly. The DNA found on it was logged and preserved. It established a unique profile for the attacker, but it remained an isolated, unsolved case for many, many years. It was the crucial link.
There's also another incident in 1990, the hospital assault.
On May 7, 1990, Edwards pleaded guilty to the aggravated assault of a social worker at Hollywood Private Hospital.
So while this incident didn't produce a DNA link to the murders,
it was important to the prosecution because it demonstrated an escalating pattern of aggression and sexual violence in public and professional settings, all in the years preceding Claremont.
And then the 1995 Claremont attack. This happened just a year before Sarah Spires vanished. This is maybe the most chilling precursor to the murders.
The parallels are astounding. This attack took place on February 12, 1995. Edwards was charged with unlawful detention and 2 counts of aggravated sexual penetration without consent.
Of a 17-year-old girl.
Yes. And she was abducted right in the heart of Claremont and Roe Park, immediately after leaving Club Bayview.
The exact location linked to Spears and Rimmer. So he was actively stalking or attacking young women in the same geographic center, using the same methods, a full year before the serial killings officially began.
He was. The victim was bound, sexually assaulted, stripped, and then deliberately abandoned in Karrakatta Cemetery.
So the fact that he was operating in the exact time and place, using abduction methods consistent with the later murders, it demonstrated a clear, established pattern.
It did. It's chilling to think that had that case been solved then, the subsequent tragedies might have been averted.
And the truly monumental breakthrough, the one that cracked the whole case open, came from linking this 1995 Karrakatta Cemetery case to the preserved evidence from the later murder investigation.
Absolutely. The DNA evidence gathered from that 1995 victim explicitly matched the DNA profile found in the Sierra Glennon murder case.
And when did this realization happen?
That occurred in 2009. And suddenly, an unknown serial killer became a known perpetrator with a confirmed pattern of violent crime centered exactly on Claremont.
So that forensic match, linking the cemetery attack to Glennon's murder, along with the 2015 fiber breakthrough,
created a convergence of evidence that pointed squarely toward Edwards.
Following his initial arrest in 2016, Edwards faced the charges for Rimmer and Glennon. Then, in February 2018, he was also charged with the willful murder of Sarah Spires,
which brought the total number of charges to 8. It's important to clarify the procedural timeline, though. He pleaded guilty to the 5 non-murder charges.
The 1988, 1990, and 1995 attacks.
Right. He pleaded guilty to those in October 2019, just before the murder trial commenced. And that admission cemented his history of violence and provided the crucial DNA chain the prosecution needed.
Before we jump into the trial itself, the sources note that in the long, dark years of Task Force Macro, other prominent suspects were heavily investigated. You should probably mention those who were ultimately ruled out.
Of course, given the high-profile nature of the case and the lack of leads, Macro was obligated to investigate anyone who fit a similar profile or timeline. One major figure was Bradley Murdoch.
The convicted backpacker murderer. What ultimately ruled him out of the Claremont investigation?
His custodial status. Murdoch was serving a prison sentence between November 1995 and February 1997.
A critical period.
It covered the disappearances of both Sarah Spires and Jane Rimmer, and the weeks leading up to C.R. Glennon's disappearance. His incarceration provided a solid alibi.
And the British murderer Mark Dixie was also named as a prime suspect at one point.
Yes, in October 2006.
Yes.
His DNA was linked to a murder in the UK, so Macro requested samples. However, after extensive analysis, Western Australia police officially ruled him out.
It just shows the global reach and persistence of the cold case review process, doesn't it?
Even during the periods of slow progress, yes.
So the trial itself became a historic event. It began in November 2019 before Supreme Court Justice Stephen Hall.
And the context of the trial was highly unusual. The public scrutiny, the decades-long nature of the case.
The defense successfully argued for a judge-alone trial, dispensing with a jury.
They did. And the request was granted specifically because the case had been so heavily publicized in Western Australia for over 20 years. It would have been almost impossible to guarantee an impartial jury.
And there was also the graphic nature of the evidence.
Exactly. Justice Hall would need to manage deeply disturbing material without the unpredictable emotional responses of a jury.
Okay, this is where the conversation needs to focus on the science. The conviction rested almost entirely on the preservation and identification of minute forensic details. Let's start with the DNA evidence.
Which the sources describe as the most damning evidence against Edwards.
And the primary forensic pillar was the DNA match from Ciara Glennon.
Correct. Edwards' DNA profile was found under Glennon's fingernails. This was forensic gold because it provided direct contact evidence. It linked the killer to the victim during the violent final struggle.
And why was the location of the DNA under the fingernails so critical?
Well, it wasn't just trace DNA on clothing, which can sometimes be explained away. DNA found under the nail bed strongly indicates defensive action.
The victim scratching or fighting back aggressively against her attacker.
Precisely. The defense, as you'd expect, launched a significant challenge. They argued this evidence might have been contaminated in the laboratory.
How?
They suggested that contamination could have occurred through the transference of Edwards' DNA from the older exhibits, like the 1988 kimono, to the Glennon samples during handling or review.
So the trial became a deep technical debate over contamination protocols versus the reliability of the DNA profile itself.
Exactly. Justice Hall had to weigh the defense's contamination arguments against the statistical improbability of an incidental match, especially when you consider the same DNA profile also matched the earlier, unrelated attacks.
The forensic chain linking all those incidents was just immensely powerful.
It was. And furthermore, pathologists confirmed to the court that both Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon had defensive wounds, which corroborated the narrative of a violent struggle that the DNA evidence suggested.
Let's move to the second critical pillar, the vehicular evidence. This tied Edwards' employment directly to the crime scenes, the Telstra connection.
Edwards was employed as a technician for Telstra, the main telecommunications company, during the critical period of 1995 to 1997.
And the prosecution built an entire circumstantial case around his access to and use of company vehicles after hours.
They did. They called it the Telstra Living Witness Project. They argued that Edwards utilized his position and his easily identifiable company car, a white station wagon, to lure, approach, and transport his victims.
What did they use to establish that he was using the vehicle for crimes and not just work?
They established a pattern of known movements and specific sightings. Edwards drove a white Holden VS Commodore executive station wagon with Telstra logos between April 1996 and December 1998.
Which was the specific vehicle model implicated by the fiber analysis breakthrough.
The very same. Furthermore, a crucial witness, the security guard, recalled seeing a Telstra van parked at Karrakatta Cemetery on multiple occasions for no apparent reason.
And crucially, this was after the 1995 attack and just before the Spires disappearance in 1996.
Yes, so the Telstra vehicle put Edwards at the scene of the 1995 crime and also near the location of the serial killings, all within the relevant time frame.
There were other witnesses too, right?
There were. Witnesses known as the Burger Boys reported seeing a Series 1 VS Commodore station wagon cruising past them shortly after C.R. Glennon was last sighted walking along Sterling Highway. They even noted the vehicle had distinctive teardrop hubcaps, a detail that helped narrow the pool down significantly.
And this brings us back to the original breakthrough, the fiber evidence. This provided the physical link between the recovered victims and Edwards' vehicle.
The fiber evidence was meticulous. Investigators recovered tiny unique fibers matching the blue polyester carpet found in the rear cargo area of Edwards' specific Holden VS Commodore.
And these fibers were recovered from the bodies of both Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon.
Correct. The analysis established a dual physical link. Glennon was linked by DNA and fibers. Rimmer was linked by the fibers alone.
So how did the defense attempt to mitigate the overwhelming implication of that evidence?
They argued that while the fibers matched the carpet in Edwards' car, the material itself was relatively common. They suggested the fibers could have come from another source or another vehicle of the same model that wasn't in the crime database.
So it created a sliver of doubt.
They tried to. In complex fiber analysis, common materials can sometimes be difficult to definitively distinguish. However, when you combine it with the direct DNA evidence and the specific context of the Telstra vehicle sightings,
The defense's argument weakened considerably.
it did.
The trial was immense, 7 months, evidence from over 200 witnesses, and it concluded in June 2020.
Justice Hall then retired for consideration and delivered a colossal 619-page written verdict. It just reflects the incredible complexity and detail of the case.
And the outcome?
Bradley Robert Edwards was found guilty of the willful murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon.
The prosecution succeeded in proving that the physical and DNA evidence, combined with his established pattern of previous attacks, confirmed his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for those 2 victims.
Yes, I did.
But the verdict on the first victim, Sarah Spires, was different.
It was. Despite the powerful circumstantial evidence and the confirmed link of Edwards to the area, Justice Hall found Edwards not guilty of Sarah Spires' murder.
And the critical factor was the lack of physical evidence.
No body, no DNA, no fibers, nothing concrete to tie him directly to her. However, Justice Hall included a crucial clarification in his verdict.
Which was?
He stated that it was more likely than not that Edwards was involved in her disappearance.
That distinction highlights the high legal burden of proof required for a conviction versus the weight of circumstantial belief.
Exactly.
The ultimate sentencing in December 2020 reflected the horrific nature of the crimes.
Edwards received a sentence of life imprisonment with eligibility for parole, only after serving 40 years. Justice Hall acknowledged the extreme cruelty of the crimes and noted the high likelihood that Edwards, given his age and length of the non-parole period, would ultimately die in prison.
And that concluded the legal chapter of the Claremont serial killings. This case didn't just impact the families of the victims, though. It defined an era for Western Australia.
It did. And in the years that followed the primary investigation, police continually revisited other long-standing missing persons cases for potential connections.
That seems like a natural step in a large-scale serial investigation.
It is. You want to identify if the perpetrator's activities spanned a longer period than you initially believed. One notable case they reviewed was that of Julie Cutler. She was 22 and vanished much earlier, in June 1988.
1988, that's much earlier than the 1996-97 period. What made police consider her case?
The circumstances were tragically similar. A young woman disappearing alone after a night out. Reports indicate police later told her father they believed she was likely a victim of the Claremont killer.
And her vehicle was found.
2 days later, in the surf near Cottesloe Beach. Although Edwards was only charged based on the later murders, that 1988 Huntingdale attack proved he was active in a pattern of violence at that time.
Which makes Cutler's case perpetually linked in profile, if not in evidence.
Precisely. And there were others, like Lisa Brown, a 19-year-old sex worker who disappeared in November 1998, and Sarah McMahon, 20, who disappeared in November 2000.
And these cases illustrate the ongoing sense of vulnerability.
And the fear that the killer might have continued operating, or that there were copycat crimes. While these linkages remain unconfirmed, they reflect the sustained media and cultural obsession with ensuring every missing person case near the area was cross-referenced.
The case's long-running presence in the media is a story in itself.
Its impact on Western Australia was profound and enduring. The sheer length of the investigation meant the narrative just evolved constantly, dominating news cycles from the initial terror to the years of cold case frustration and the final shocking arrest.
The sources highlight that the story has fueled multiple documentaries and dedicated investigative projects.
It has. This media coverage really reflects the public's need to understand how such a prolonged and terrifying crime could happen, and how justice could take so very long to deliver.
If we connect this back to the broader picture of modern policing and cold case work, what does this massive effort, Task Force Macro, ultimately teach us?
It speaks volumes about the evolution of criminal investigation. Macro, in its initial phases, struggled immensely. It was criticized for its politics, its cost, and its damaging reliance on speculative behavioral profiling.
And ultimately, its decade-long focus on Lance Williams.
Yes, true. Decisive closure only arrived because of the transformation of forensic science.
So the answer wasn't necessarily in the thousands of interviews or the psychological pressure tactics.
No. The crucial factors were the meticulous preservation of tiny forensic materials, the microfibers, the DNA from the 1988 kimono, the DNA under Glennon's fingernails, which decades later could be subjected to infinitely more sensitive analysis.
So cold case review, leveraging DNA breakthroughs, that provided the unavoidable path to conviction.
It did. It shows that persistence in data preservation, combined with scientific advancement, is the greatest tool for overcoming long periods of investigative stagnation.
The conclusion brought decisive closure for the Rimmer and Glennon families, but we return to the fate of Sarah Spires. Edwards was found not guilty of her murder, yet the judge strongly suggested he was involved. Her remains are still missing.
And this raises an important question for you to consider. When a serial case is solved and the perpetrator is imprisoned for life, what does the lingering absence of a first victim, the failure to locate Sarah Spires' remains, tell us about the limitations of justice? Even in a case that is factually concluded, the inability to provide a final resting place means a critical element of closure is still tragically unattainable for one family. That gap in the justice narrative remains the most critical and enduring element of the tragedy.
That is truly a sobering thought to end on. We've covered the initial tragedy in Claremont, the intense, costly, and controversial investigation by Task Force Macro, the critical context provided by Bradley Robert Edwards' prior crimes from 1988 onward, and the crucial forensic links, the DNA, the specific fibers, and the vehicular evidence that finally led to his conviction for 2 of the murders. Thanks for listening.